Chairman.
Senator Braun.
I want to offer my amendment number one. It's to ensure that an employment relationship is not established between a franchisor and a franchisee if the franchisor engages in certain activities. This amendment, which is also a bill I've introduced, is intended to protect franchisors from engaging in socially responsible business practices with their franchisees. Oftentimes, franchisors have access to resources that franchisees do not. However, by requiring the use of these resources, these companies risk a court ruling that they are acting as joint employers of franchise employees. This amendment would allow a franchisor to require the use of certain literature, policies, and training for socially good programs, such as the promotion of apprenticeships, scholarships, child care, paid family leave, as well as many others. Preventing discrimination, sexual harassment, workplace violence. Under this amendment, franchisors would be encouraged to share the resources that are good for both them and the franchisee employees, society at large, without facing the risk of being improperly classified as a joint employer by a court. And I'll ask for a vote on that.
I oppose Senator Braun's amendment. This amendment would make it harder for workers at large franchises like McDonald's, a company that made over $6 billion in profits last year, from exercising their constitutional right to form a union and collectively bargain for better wages, benefits, and working conditions. The law is clear. Workers have a right to collectively bargain with all employers. This amendment erodes that fundamental right. This amendment is a poison pill clearly designed to undermine the entire bill. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment. Discussion. Senator Cassidy.
Senator Braun, real quick question. You're just saying that if McDonald's, whatever they've earned, which seems beside the point, if McDonald's comes up with material that would prevent sexual harassment, that would make people more sensitive to those who are different than themselves, they could share it with the franchisees so they could train their employers, and that would make it, that would not somehow create a joint employer relationship.
All things I think the chairman of the committee would be interested in as well, but not to where it would trigger some type of court issue by doing that.
So if we don't do this, it discourages the McDonald's of the world from creating that material. And it makes it more likely that there's sexual harassment or abuse if that's going to occur, because it may be unwitting, but they're not getting the material that's been shown to be effective.
It'd be counter, I think, to what both sides of the aisle would be interested in general.
My gosh, this seems like a good amendment, but if we want to do so, if we want to use the resources that a big corporation can develop in order to train people to live more in more harmony with others, that seems like something we should encourage, not put them at legal risk if they in turn use it. I yield.
Further discussion.
I have amendment number two.
Yes, Senator Braun. Is that amendment number two coming up?
Yes. To amend the NLRA Act to reform the National Labor Relations Board, the Office of the General Counsel, in the process for appellate review. Under the Biden administration, the National Labor Relations Board is chosen to engage in partisan advocacy rather than doing its job. I have continuously held that the NLRB to account during the past 2.5 years for their failure to protect American workers and employers. This amendment, which is also a bill introduced by Senator Blackburn and I that would be happy to have others on as a co-sponsor, will return the agency to its intended purpose. That is, as an independent federal agency that acts as an impartial body in deciding cases related to the National Labor Relations Act. This amendment would end the partisanship at the NLRB by increasing the number of board members from 5 to 6 and requiring an even split among Republicans and Democrats sitting on the board. Further, it would require all board members to approve all decisions, which would ensure bipartisanship. This amendment would work also to encourage a quick resolution of cases before the board by allowing parties to appeal to a federal court of appeals if the board fails to reach a decision in the case within 1 year.
Further discussion. I oppose Senator Braun's amendment. This amendment would make it harder for workers to join a union and receive a first union contract. Unfortunately, as currently drafted, I'm afraid that the only people who would benefit from this amendment are corporate executives who are engaged in illegal union busting, the same folks who are working overtime to prevent workers from successfully forming a union. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment at the appropriate time. Further discussion.
You know, just to comment on this, the chair has characterized this as a partisan, but you're actually making the NLRB nonpartisan. And so if there's a Republican president and we have and a Republican Senate and House and we have 3 Republicans instead of 2 Democrats, this would actually work to mitigate that swing of jurisdiction and would allow those on this side of the aisle, their constituents, if you will, to more quickly go to court. This actually restores it to what it originally was supposed to be, a neutral arbiter, as opposed to having an activist general counsel who's putting her thumb on the scale to make it go in one direction.
I think you hit it right on the head. And again, if things were flipped, I'm sure the other side might be for this. To me, this is a model, a paradigm that works regardless of who's in charge.
Okay.
Further discussion or new amendments?
One more amendment.
Senator Braun.
Amendment number 3, to preserve provisions in the National Labor Relations Act and Labor Management Relations Act 1947 regarding the prohibition of secondary boycotts. This amendment strikes language in the PRO Act that allows for secondary boycotts. Secondary boycott is an industrial action taken by a union against a company on grounds that the company does business with another company that is currently engaged in a labor dispute. The National Labor Relations Act currently protects the right to strike or picket a primary employer, an employer with whom a union has a labor dispute, but it also seeks to keep neutral employers from being dragged into the fray. The PRO Act would allow unions to participate in secondary boycotts throughout the supply chain, which would inflict economic damage on all small businesses that have nothing to do with the labor dispute. It is currently unlawful for a union to coerce a neutral employer to force it to cease doing business with a primary employer. My amendment preserves current law.
I oppose Senator Braun's amendment. The PRO Act repeals harmful anti-union measures enacted in Taft-Hartley over 75 years ago. Since 1947, Taft-Hartley has done exactly what it was intended to do: make it harder for workers to exercise their fundamental right to strike and form unions. Repealing these unfair rules is long overdue and is exactly the kind of change to our nation's outdated labor laws that we need to enact. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment at the appropriate time. Senator Cassidy.
You know, I can imagine some small businesswoman is out there saying, this isn't the PRO Act, this is the Anti-Small Business Act. We're talking about secondary strikes. You can still go after the big kahuna. But when the small business is out there, the small contractor who's a job creator, who's the one who's the employer, the owner, is working 100 hours a week to make ends meet, and she gets a strike on her as a secondary strike, she doesn't have the deep pockets to absorb that. She goes out of business. There's provision after provision in this bill which is just going after her, just striking her, just trying to nail her down. I think it's so wrong. I agree with your amendment, Senator Braun, and I think if we just imagine have a little bit of sympathy for these small businesses, I think this would have bipartisan support. I urge support of this amendment.
One final comment here, if I might.
Senator Braun.
I try to pick things that are practical, and then I hear from the street, like the NFIB. I came from a world of small business, and you got to remember, a small business is a blue-collar job wrapped into all the responsibilities of being on the line, and no business ever gets large unless you start small. And the last thing we ought to be doing through here is promoting policy that makes it harder for businesses to start, because at some point you'll need that heavy offset of a union against large corporations. I'm talking about why go after the gig economy, independent contractors, and small businesses. Someday we know where that takes us. These are all practical amendments that we ought to be supporting. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Further amendments?
Mr. Chairman.